All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the third part of our three-part webinar series on data training for the small farm. I know a lot of you have been on the series for the whole time, so we'll kind of rush through these introductory slides. We could go to the next one. So just a recap on our learning objectives for the entire series. For today, we're going to be digging deeper into how to use data for market channel evaluation and scenario planning. So we actually have a case study, Shanley Farms, on that we'll be highlighting as part of that. And then Prem will be guiding us through the rest of the workshop today. And next slide, please. I won't spend up too much time on this, but this webinar is brought to you by Community Alliance of Family Farmers. We're a nonprofit that supports small family farms across California. So this data webinar series is part of the Small Farm Tech Hub. Go to the next slide. And the Small Farm Tech Hub is supporting, we're a newer program at CAF. We're about to have our 2-year anniversary. And we're helping to identify the right fit and appropriate technologies for small farms across California. And we've really been focusing on digital technology as it relates to e-commerce, marketing, how to get your farm a better online presence through Google search engines and different things like that. So data very much falls in line with all that. So we've been grateful to have been able to partner with Data Elevates to provide you this training that kind of focuses on data literacy and getting into the nitty-gritty with what parts of data are important for business decisions. All right, and yeah, so this is our last part. We had 2 other webinars on November 16th and November 30th. Those recordings are posted on YouTube if you need to catch up. And please feel free to share them with anyone else in your network who may benefit from this series. And I will pass it over to Brian now to take us away. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks to everyone who is participating and has participated particularly in several the different sessions. Definitely, if you haven't seen the other sessions, definitely recommend checking them out. So this is going to be, as Elizabeth mentioned, this is going to be our second, essentially a part 2 on market channel data evaluations. We're going to be really focusing on how to use sort of like a systematic approach essentially to evaluating your market channels and where does data belong within all of that. So definitely looking at a sort of a comprehensive evaluation sort of approach to it. So just diving in, a quick agenda, doing introductions. Obviously now we're going to have do a little bit of recap in session 1 and session 2 for those that have not been there during those sessions or just need a quick recap. And then we're going to have I'll have a sort of a moderated discussion that will open it up to everyone and talking with Shanley Farms. And then we're going to go into sort of like the key area of sort of like the session today, which is really around how to assess new market channels and a sort of a scientific approach to that I think applies well to the situation many farmers have at hand, including we'll also have a pilot. I realize I spelled activity wrong there, but a pilot study activity. And then we'll just go into lessons learned, which lessons learned, we're doing a little bit of a recap and provide some time for Q&A, given that this is particularly the last session of this sort of 3-part series. Okay, so I think I'll probably just still quickly go through this, but very fast, because I think many of you have seen before. So yeah, my name is Prem Raj. I'm head of business strategy and operations at Data Elevates. And Data Elevates, just for those that haven't heard yet, we're an organization that really focuses on building the capacity for entrepreneurs, underserved communities, as well as social impact organizations to essentially use data for good. And so I personally have had quite a bit of experience in the food system space as well. And both Zan and I have quite a bit of experience in workforce development. I've worked with farmers in regards to business strategy, financial management. We've led sessions on data for decision making, and so we're super happy to be here working with you all. Zan?
Sure, thanks, Prem. And my name is Zan Paxton. I'm head of data insights here at Data Elevates, and I lead our work in data analytics and data systems. I also work with organizations to help them better understand how they can use data in their management practices. So I'm really excited to get to meet you guys and present to you today. Thanks, Prem.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate it. All right. So yeah, before we start, always like to throw this out there in the workshops we do. First of all, definitely want to emphasize that chat freely in the chat, I guess. Definitely put in questions and comments, thoughts, anything. Throw it all in there. We definitely will be looking through those comments and raising any questions as they come up as well. If you can, I know this is a particularly challenging for people who are sort of like potentially on the field. But turning videos on is always fun, so we can sort of see people's faces when you can. But definitely keeping mics on mute unless you're talking. And because it's not obviously a giant crowd, so I think the chat is good. But also, if there's questions people have, just feel free to unmute yourself and just ask a question if I miss it. That's totally fine. And as I think everyone should have seen the little thing pop up, just to be clear, we're recording this session. Alrighty. So I wanted to just ask a few questions. I'm trying to see if everyone, I don't think everyone, yeah, I think some of these, anyway, you can entertain me if everyone's been in the different sessions. I was trying to quickly just check. So really quickly, can we just go across, I guess, the virtual room here and see what does your farm sell? What markets do you sell in? Why are you interested in this session? And I just added a question here in terms of just a general question. When you think of how you use data in your business or in your farm, like what comes to mind? How do you feel like data is really supporting your business operations? Yeah, I will. Anyone want to go first, or should I can pick up someone? Well, Petrinka, since you're going to be talking later anyway, if you can, I can throw you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, definitely.
Okay. Our farm sells a number of items. Our primary crop is avocados late season. We're the last area in California that has avocados. And then we do finger limes, which is a crop that was indigenous to Australia. And now it's being grown up in this country. And we also do passion fruit and a couple other specialties. We sell in a number of different markets. We sell in retail, we sell in schools, we sell in food service, and we sell to specialty markets, I guess you could say. And we're interested in this session because we've just started really looking at data, because during the pandemic, we upped our game on doing online sales because we had to. And so I'm just interested in seeing, what else we can learn and use the data for.
Perfect. Thanks, Petrinka. And yeah, very much appreciated. And we'll talk a little bit more, obviously, with you in a second here. And actually, I think, unless I'm mistaken here, I believe everyone else has been in the different sessions. So I think we'll probably just keep moving on at this point. So not recapping same things we've had at different sessions. But yeah, thank you for that as a newcomer to the sessions. All right, so let's just keep moving on here. Okay, so I do think it's still useful to have a quick recap here. So some of the things we've learned so far. So from session 1, which was, I guess, about a month ago at this point, because it's been every 2 weeks, which is on using data in small farm decision making. The key point here is thinking about this cycle that we have on the right side, which we call the data-driven decision making cycle. So when we think about decisions, and honestly, this goes to really any process itself, business process. So, but it certainly applies to farms just as well as it applies to other businesses. When we think about decision, when we think about data, there's so much data that's available, and this data is being constantly generated. Of course, this is, it's nothing new to say that the data being generated is growing and growing and growing. It has been for years and decades at this point. But that being said, with farmers particularly, and particularly small farmers having so little availability to use that data, in terms of, it's not like most small farmers don't have like 10, 15 people who are able to sort of like dig through data to sort of make the decisions. It's really important to be efficient with how you're using that data, and to be efficient. And actually, this fits super well into how we're going to talk about sort of evaluating new markets later on. But we really need to think about the demand for information. So what are we trying to answer before we actually go out and collect data? What are we trying to answer? What is our need for getting that data? Like, are we trying to figure out information about a new market? Are we trying to figure out how to optimize our crop production for a certain crop? The more specific we can get, the better. And we'll actually get to that point a little bit later as well. Once you have that kind of a question, then sort of things flow from there, where it's about, collecting data sources, or if the data sources aren't already available to make some sort of decisions, it's about capturing that information. Then it's about, within your own business, finding a place to store that data, right? Ideally, this information is all digital as possible. I know this can be challenging sometimes for farmers out in the field, but as I think, ideally, as much of it can be digital as possible. Having a place to put that information, ideally in one place. And more people are using the cloud for this because it just creates more accessibility. Access and permissions is probably more usable, more connected to large organizations, but having some sort of security, of course, in your data is useful. Being able to analyze it, and in relation again to the question that you have, which is the demand for information, right? What are you demanding this? Why are you demanding this information? And then finally, if you need to create bar charts and things like that, you might not need to, but that's interpretation and storytelling. And the last point here is really on data-driven decision making. So ultimately, the point there is that ultimately, there's really no point from a business operation standpoint in collecting the data if you're not actually using it to make a decision, which is why it starts from thinking about what type of question you have. And it ends with making a decision off of the information you get. So that's like a key way to think about it. Next time you're sort of like trying to collect information or have information in front of you, really thinking about, did I need to collect this information, or is there something else I need to collect because there's these questions that I have? I think that's the key point I want to just mention on the session 1. And then in terms of session 2, on market channel data evaluations, and again, definitely encouraged to go back to the recordings on this. But really, we talked about opportunity costs, we talked about risk factors, and how to sort of utilize a scenario planning approach to essentially evaluate markets when there are these risk factors. You're not sure, when you're not entirely sure, of course, what kind of quantity you're going to sell, what kind of price you're going to sell at, among so many other risk factors that can be out there, which of course may differ between, say, a CSA or a farmer's market, where it can be very variable, to maybe like a school district where maybe the price is slightly lower, but maybe there's a little bit more consistency. So like sort of thinking through these different scenarios is critical. And we sort of talked through that a little bit at the last session. All right. Any questions on those things before I sort of go into this session? All right. Cool. And we'll have a chance for a Q&A at the end of this as well. But feel free to ask questions as we go. So our goals for today. So key steps to evaluate a market channel utilizing experimental design. We'll talk about what that actually means in a second. Data playing a role in market channel evaluation. So within this sort of design, this sort of approach to evaluating the market channel, or evaluating the market channels, I should say, actually might not necessarily be new. Where does data fit into that? And how do you effectively use data within it? We're talking a little bit about, furthering that in terms of developing a pilot study, which frankly, we all do to some extent. It just might not be called pilot study. And then how the feedback loop supports this process, and it supports optimizing your markets, and basically integrating sort of like where data fits in within all of this. Okay, cool. So that's kind of what we're going to get into to start it off, I wanted to actually just have, and this is more of a broader discussion than maybe just this session, but I think it applies well to the overall themes of like this series that we have. We're really happy to have Patrinka here from Shanley Farms, and just really grateful for her time to sort of talk a little bit about farm and talk a little bit about some of the challenges and how they sort of use data to support in relation to some of those challenges to improve their business. Patrinka, I don't know if I have a few questions I wanted to just ask, and then I'm thinking we can open it up to see if others have questions for you as well.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yep.
All right, cool. Okay, so I think we already got to where is your farm located, what do you sell, and where? And can you remind everyone where you sell again?
Well, we sell into a number of different channels. I mean, during the pandemic, we were forced to kind of up our game for the online sales because retail did something called SKU rationalization on specialty items. And that means basically they weren't buying them. They were only buying hard items. And so we upped our game on the online sales and started using social media and doing a newsletter to improve our sales, online sales. And then we do sell at retail. We sell just food service. We sell to schools. So we have a number of different channels that we work with. So, and you know, you have to tailor your program to each one of those channels because they all operate differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I'm not sure about the farms here, but I've definitely, there needed to be some sort of outlet, of course, particularly in the height of the pandemic, in terms of farmers having to transition. Definitely a very tough time. And it's definitely commendable in terms of like it sounds like sort of your kind of intentional decision to find a market that will actually work during such an intense time. So that sounds great. A question I had actually here was just in relation to selling via, I'm going to talk a little bit more of the online sales stuff here. So in relation to selling online, like what do you feel are some of the key drivers to success and in how you're selling your product online? Like, what are some of the key things that you try to focus on?
Well, I mean, you got to get people's attention first, and it was easier during the pandemic because everybody was locked at home and bored out of their minds. So we had a lot more participation from people during the pandemic. But something else we did is we evaluated from the data that we got through MailChimp. We were able to determine our sales base or our customer base a little bit better. And so we discovered that there were businesses that were buying from us. And so we split our regular consumers and businesses and approached each of those differently. Because the businesses were looking, can we get a discount? And, we're going to buy this much. And so it was more of a negotiation process and following up with those people versus just doing consumer sales. And we did a newsletter, a biweekly newsletter, and that was more that was focused more on the consumers. They like to hear about the family and how does the family work and, that kind of thing. And then, that's pretty much how we did it. I mean, we did social media on the consumer side to try and drive new people onto our site and, to get them to buy because, they have to on the newsletters or anything we send out, they have to say whether or not they want to get our emails. And that's tough. And so we had to come up with different ways to try and drive that. So And that was social media and the newsletter and that sort of thing. We did sales. We had on LinkedIn and on Facebook, we did Finger Lime Fridays and did cocktails, because people were drinking a lot more during the pandemic. So, we've just tried to do fun stuff, to get their attention and get them to participate.
Absolutely. No, that's Finger Lime Fridays is catchy. I like it.
Yeah.
But I did want to focus on a point there in terms of you're tracking information through MailChimp, and I'm just trying to sort of put things together here. It sounds like you're sort of, in some sense, you're tracking not only sales, but you're also just tracking the how well you're connecting to your audience.
Right. But it also, what it does is it tells you each one of our newsletters was a campaign. And so it would tell us, the data comes in and it tells you, here's how many sales you got. This was, the success of this campaign. So it made it a lot easier for us to go through that data and go, okay, they seem to be responding more to information about the family at the farm, than a pitch, or yeah, they like the pitch on this item and a discount, so it made it easier for us to determine what we were going to do as far as, trying different stuff to improve the sales.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, just to sort of think through, see it from kind of what I imagine, you can tell me if this is off here, but in terms of an overall process, it's almost like you guys kind of, so of course sales is always critical here, but beyond the sales, you sort of knew that building these audience, understand, being able to relate to your audience is going to be critical here and that's why you're using newsletters. You're sort of trying to figure out the read rate, it sounds like, things like that. And so MailChimp allowed you to sort of track that data to then continue to improve how you're sort of connecting to the audience.
Right. And then, that goes back to working with retail also. Smaller farmers can work with retail two different ways, one in a local program, but also, if you look at your data, your online data, and you say, well, I'm making sales in this market area, you go find that retailer and say, we have consumers that are buying direct from us. Do you want to carry our item? Because it's tough to get into retail. And so, by doing that, at least you sound like you know what you're talking about, when you say, we have these consumers that are obviously interested in our items and, you might want to bring them in,
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that makes complete sense. And it sounds like, that's kind of, I think the key element here is sort of the idea that you sort of knew the value of building of these relationships. You knew the value of having to be able to connect, particularly through online sales, where more and more, of course, everyone, but particularly farmers, are selling online. So you kind of need to stand out and through your connection to the audience. One thing I was just kind of wondering, just to sort of, I guess, wrap up kind of the my discussion, that we can definitely open up to everyone else to ask questions as well, was just how effective has all this gotten? I mean, have you seen, do you feel like from the data you've been able to see that you've been able to connect with the audience further, or is there a lot, have you seen improvements, I guess?
Yeah, I guess I would say the three things probably that, or the two things that really kind of stand out in my mind, is some kind of a social media program that's consistent, and then a program where you're reaching out to that audience that comes in. I mean, I get so many junk emails in my email, but send them an email, send them a newsletter so that they know what's going on with your operation. Or, some of the bigger guys in the produce industry are starting to do videos, either on, some of them are on LinkedIn, but, some of them are doing it on Facebook or, whatever outlet you feel comfortable with. And that helps them connect with you, I guess it were.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, this is super useful, and it's a good example of, again, having a sort of an intention to, in your case, connect with the audience, figuring out how to use data to do that. Finding it out, utilizing an application that can track that data, which is MailChimp in this case, and then using that to sort of adjust. And of course, it's never a perfect situation. There's no like foolproof plan to these things, but at least now it sounds like you're able to use some of this information to kind of improve on how you're connecting with your audience, and ultimately, presumably, getting more sales that way.
Yeah, we also use a QR code from HarvestMart, and there's back-end data on there, and that tells you, where the QR code was scanned. In this case, it'd probably be retail. And there's a section for people to make comments. So we've gotten consumer comments. And so all that kind of information is helpful when you're talking to a buyer, to say, yeah, well, here's this person said this, and so it just elevates the conversation from, I have 10 boxes and I'm going to sell it to you for this amount,
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Petrinka. I wanted to see if others had questions. Could be anything from Shanley Farms, but ideally specifically sort of related to just sort of how they're using their data, or collecting the data, kind of how that process has gone. Yeah. Any questions from others? I'll give a second here. All right.
Well, I definitely had a
Okay.
question.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone?
Petrinka, I'd love to hear a breakdown of how you all decided to diversify your sales, by what like percentage point or seasonality. If you added on the finger limes at a certain point, and the reason why that you did. I'm thinking of, you said school sales. So I'm wondering if you try to keep that a certain percentage just to help, buffer a margin that you guys are looking at throughout the year. I'm just curious to hear more on the breakdown of your sales channels, if you don't mind sharing.
Well, Jim Shanley was the one that fell in love with finger limes. And he did it more because he really felt that he had a passion for them. And he thought, that, these would be a wonderful item. But any kind of I sold specialties for almost 20 years. Any kind of specialty item is pushing a rock uphill, because you have to introduce people to it and get them to try it. And, you end up doing a lot of different things, from demoing in a retailer to, developing your online sales just to try and introduce people to them. And so, it's a number of different things. You look at it and see what the response is. I really, really think, that we as the produce industry don't do enough to have a relationship with the end user. And I think that has more to do with finding out what they're looking for, and then taking that back to, the food service sector, the retail sector, the schools. And the schools are driven by whatever grant is available. So you have to educate yourself on what grants are out there, what does it focus on, and would that work for your farm to develop something that would take advantage of that grant? So it's a lot of different things that go into it. It is, everybody knows it's in farming. It's not an easy thing. But luckily, a lot of retailers are starting to put together local programs. And so I would encourage anybody that's growing to, you know, meet with the retailer or find out if they're putting a local program together, and then get your data together on what you're going to have and what's available. And I will tell you, retail works 6 to 9 months out. You can't wait until you know, you're getting ready to harvest. You have to go in 6 to 8 months out, 6 to 9 months out, and say, here's what we're looking at. And they may give you feedback that, you know, may change what you end up doing. So, you know, I would really encourage anybody that's, you know, listening to take that kind of approach rather than saying, wow, I'm going to grow 10% more than I did last year. Don't know where I'm going to sell it, but I'm going to grow 10% more, you know? So it's really important that you do your homework.
Well, thank you. Sorry, Elizabeth, did you want to? Okay.
Oh, no, I was just gonna thank her. Yeah, I'm happy to. I feel like I could ask a whole bunch of questions, but I'll stop myself.
Absolutely. You're clearly a wealth of knowledge, Patrinka. So I feel like we could do a 3-hour session just interviewing Patrinka here. But thank you again. Super useful on the for this session, but frankly, just in general in relation, you clearly have a lot of experience on the as a farmer and as in sales, particularly in relation to some of these products. So thanks again, Patrinka, and we're just gonna move on.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so you still see my screen? Yeah. So we're gonna go into kind of the bulk of this this session, which is on how to make an assessment. So we're gonna start at a 10,000 foot view here. So really fundamental to honestly almost any evaluation that is sort of particularly like a quantitative evaluation is the scientific method. Probably most, if not all of you, have at least heard of the scientific method. We're not going to go very far into this, but just as a framing device, you know, it really follows making an observation, having a question, developing a question, which we will talk about in a second. This should be something that is, in fact, I'll just note it here. Fundamental approach. Question itself should be a specific, relevant, objective, and testable, normally comparison against the control or current state. So diving into that a little bit further, this relates to that idea that was mentioned before in terms of the data-driven decision-making cycle, the idea of demanding information to some extent. It's very similar to what we're talking about here, right? For a question, you know, we're talking about a farmer's market, for example, or anything, but if we're talking about sort of, yeah, if you want to enter into new farmer's market, if you're going to be developing a question to evaluate against, the question itself needs to be very specific and relevant. And this idea of being testable is incredibly important, right? So, if I go into a farmer's market and sell 20% of my, lettuce at that farmer's market, as opposed to through a CSA, how much will my sales increase from this year to last year, something like that. Something that is very like specific and actually you can test, you can compare against where you're actually currently at is an important point here. We're going to go through an exercise on some of this later, but that's a key element to this. So then you have a hypothesis, and some of this is just terminology of the scientific method. A hypothesis is basically, what you're essentially your educated guess on what this would be. It'd be, yes, I do think that this would happen. Experiment is actually the idea of implementing it and like piloting it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then ultimately you'll do analysis and you're reaching conclusion. How much did you actually sell at the farmer's market? How did that compare to how you were selling last year through the CSA for that same amount of product? Where do we go from there? And so, yeah, analysis either supports or does not support your hypothesis. Of course, I'm very much generalizing scientific method here, but this is the very general idea. And so I'm going to drill down a little bit further for this. First of all, notice that the method itself is a circle. It doesn't end at a conclusion. The conclusion might actually be like kind of a misnomer there, because it's not concluding actually. It can conclude, but you can actually continue this, which is why it's a circle. You can make another observation off of where you ended up at in terms of your conclusion. And so I'm going to focus this on a little bit, this idea of a feedback loop. So, which is, you do something, you measure it, you analyze it, how you did, you're analyzing how you did, and then you make corrections. And then you make corrections, and actually you repeat what you were doing, but with those corrections. And then again, you measure it, and so you try to continuously improve, optimize what you're doing. And of course, this can relate to all sorts of business processes. One thing to note in relation to a feedback loop is that, in relation to this diagram specifically, that is missing one thing, and it's actually in the scientific method, which is know what you want to do before doing something. Right? This seems to start with doing something, but this goes into the idea you need to have some sort of a question or some sort of specific thing you're measuring against, right? Which is why it's useful to have some sort of question, a quantifiable, testable question. If you do, then you can know what you're measuring, you know what your data you're collecting to analyze, and then correct and improve on it. I'll do one more. I'm going to go through one more slide here, then I'm going to particularly pause for questions. But again, if you have any questions, you can put in the chat or interrupt me. That's also fine. So just to connect it further into entering into new markets, CSAs, farmers markets, retail, restaurant, any of them. There's some key questions we need to ask, right? When we're doing some sort of an evaluation, what would we want to measure and evaluate in the new market, and why do we want to do that, right? Like, do we want to measure the amount sold at a certain price, and why would we want to do that? Because we of course want to optimize our overall sales, and probably want to compare it against the how we were doing where we were selling it before, which is why, say you're selling it through a CSA, now you're selling it through a farmer's market. Are you actually doing better now than you were before? So there needs to be some sort of questions and thought process beforehand. Who's handling data collection? When would we evaluate how the new market is working out? So this goes into the idea of, which we'll talk about in a second, the idea of iterative improvement, piloting, essentially having a pilot approach, and this whole feedback loop. If you're looking at the diagram here again, right? This implies that there's at some point, at the end of 4 weeks, let's say it's weekly farmers markets, pretty normal, right? So after 4 farmers markets, we want to see how we're doing in relation to a question we have, right? And then you can assess it. So there needs to be some sort of time element of it to really analyze and improve. How will we gauge how things are going? What types of corrections do we make, and what will we evaluate again? You can just keep evaluating, but there needs to be the idea here really is there needs to be some sort of a overall system or approach that needs to be, in order to optimize how these evaluations go, there needs to be some sort of system basically that we're using to evaluate, right? For farmers markets, let's say it's, I'm going to do what I'm doing at the price I have it at, for selling this product for a month, 2 months maybe, right? Maybe we want to go through 8 weeks, so 8 different times, seeing how it sells, seeing how lettuce sells at a certain price, for example, and then kind of evaluating and adjusting from there. But there needs to be some element of that time for it. So I'm going to stop for a second and see if people have questions, first of all, before I sort of dive further into this. But I wanted to just I think the key thing here is about like being intentional with an approach, and you're collecting data to measure against the questions you have, or the question you have. Any element, any part of that like I should clarify, or you have any questions about possible I could be going too fast. Sure. Just let me. All right. Okay. Everyone soaked everything in. Perfect. Always good. Yeah, definitely let me know if there's something here. That any question you might have in relation to any of this. So I'm just going to, I will move on then from this point to then thinking about, well, actually, I did actually want to have to ask a question here before moving on. So we've been talking about evaluating new markets. I mean, how do those in the, I guess in the audience, participants of the session, like, how do you guys see, I mean, how have you been evaluating your new markets? Do you have some sort of approach, or any examples of how you've done it, say entering any sort of market, farmers market, retail, restaurants, any of them? Like, is there a way that you've sort of been evaluating how you've been doing, and any sort of, yeah, any thoughts there? I could call on people. Well, Marie, are you there? Maybe not. All right. Well, I will keep on going. But yeah, I will keep on going.
It looks like Marie was about to go off mute, and then I would be curious to hear if Pachinka is still able to speak up on how they've maybe evaluated their latest new market channel, maybe, or what questions they asked. But yeah, Marie, if
that'd be great.
I saw you go off mute, Marie, if you wanted to chime in.
Sorry, took me a minute to get to the mute off.
Oh, no worries.
We tend to evaluate by the plant as opposed to by the market. So that's one of the reasons I came on here, is to find ways to evaluate by the market.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. So you're seeing sort of the yeah, okay. I mean, can you talk a little bit further in terms of like how, like, sort of your approach to evaluating by the plant, I guess, in terms of like how do you you don't need to go into specifics here, but generally, how do you see it as a success, as opposed to, you know, as opposed to potentially having to substitute with something else?
Generally by turnover for the plant. So how long have we been holding on to it? The easiest way to evaluate that is how big is it gotten? So are we selling it in 4-inch containers? Are we selling them in 1-gallon containers? Are we selling them in 5-gallon containers? How many of those size sell? Do they sell better in 5-gallon versus in 4-inch? So that's typically how we evaluate.
Okay. And then are you also, because that sounds like it's looking on the quantity sold, right? Are you also sort of, or how are you also sort of evaluating on I guess the financially in terms of like the amount, the not the amount sold, sorry, the dollar value, I guess. Are you looking at it in terms of on that side in terms of the price per quantity sold, or how does that go for you?
That definitely does take an aspect of it, because of course, the larger the container, the more we get for each container. But the faster the turnover typically means that they're going to sell in smaller containers. So we usually bulk up on those so that we can have enough to get them into the larger containers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of an aspect of both. It's are they turning over so fast that we don't have enough? Are they turning over so slow that we're not selling them in the small containers? We're only selling them once they get really big. So like we do better with our oak trees in the 5 gallons versus in the small liners.
Okay.
People want trees that are a bit bigger, but when it comes to things like our Salvia apiana, we typically sell them equally throughout the sizes because it's so popular in every size.
Okay.
So turnover in general is how we evaluate if we're going to keep the plant. But the turnover per size also has a large aspect of it.
Okay. And then just one more, more question I have right now, really quickly, is that so obviously turnover is like a key metric for you. But how do you how often are you doing this sort of evaluation to sort of measure against one another in terms of that turnover? Like, is this like every quarter, or like how often or is it anyway? Any thoughts on that?
Generally semi-annually.
Okay.
Because spring is usually too busy for us to have a lot of time to evaluate. And the same for fall. So we usually evaluate during summer and winter when it slows down a little bit. So we have more time to sit at a computer and put in that kind of data.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. Super useful. Yeah. All right. I'm going to keep moving on here. And actually, I think this is more of a question for participants, but Sarah had a question in the chat here, but I'm curious about specific tools that folks are using or that you might recommend for efficient data analysis other than Excel. So you're talking about analysis in relation to like any data analysis? Are you talking about in terms of like evaluating, I guess, market sales? There we go. But what are people using, I guess? Let me ask the question there to the farmers in the audience. Are you using any sort of, are there any sort of tools that you all are using?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, Miss Petrinka. You're asking like how do you view the data, or how it's consolidated? Because, I mean, just for an example on online sales, that's why I like MailChimp, because they do it for you, so it's, they have all the metrics and everything else like that, and it just spits a report out for you. So I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, to view the data, and it depends on what you're looking at, what kind of data you're looking at.
Yeah, I think, That's a good question. And Marie said mentioned QuickBooks, but usually export it to Excel to evaluate, which I imagine there's also an export feature within my guess is in Mailchimp as well.
I just
Yeah,
realized I could unmute myself. I hope that's okay.
yeah, absolutely. I was just going to ask to see if you could unmute yourself. Yeah.
To kind of clarify, you asked, Patrinka, you mentioned consolidating. That's exactly what I was talking about. So as a farm, if you have data from several sales outlets, where are you pulling that all together so that you can evaluate not only each individual market and what's happening, but also outlet versus different outlets?
Right. Well, using retail as an example, QuickBooks has a sales report you can run, so you can do an evaluation by customer, on what their sales are and the items that they're buying. So that's really helpful, because then you can have a discussion and say, okay, here's what we're looking at this year. This is what you were able to do. We did this promotion. And if we do 3 of the same kind of promotions throughout the peak period of our production, then, we can look at maybe increasing the sales by X amount. And that's from QuickBooks, but that's taking the data and interpreting it and sharing it with that market channel or that person in the market channel that you want to expand your sales with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Marie, for also responding as well. Yeah, super useful. Thanks. So just kind of moving on here. So another way to think about the data that's being collected, again, in relation to evaluate a market channel, it needs to essentially respond to a SMART question. And you might have heard of the terminology SMART or the acronym SMART before, but essentially stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So again, when you're doing sort of a question, when you're trying to let's see, for example, Patricia was just talking about the and this obviously was not necessarily mentioned from Trinket, but like online sales. So you're trying to measure the interested in the types of connection you're building with your audience, and you want to say maybe a question is, if I start sort of if I start utilizing newsletters or having weekly newsletters sent go out, can I increase my read rate or something like that by like 20%? I'm just throwing ideas out there, right? So it's something that's like specific, measurable, because there's actually an increase that you can see, attainable in terms of you can actually attain data in relation to this. Like Mailchimp obviously does monitor read-through rates. Relevant, because you can sort of make a decision off of it. And I guess I didn't make that time-based. I don't think I did, but say over the next 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is, but there needs to be some time element to it. And so collecting data that meets that sort of responds to a question that is SMART is kind of what we're trying to get to entirely here, for evaluating new markets, but also evaluating and improving your current market that you're in. So that's kind of like, I guess, a key way to think about it. So moving on, kind of like the next part of this really is in piloting a new market, right? So what is a pilot? I'll just read this first sort of definition. A pilot is a small scale, and this is an abbreviated version of it really, but a pilot is a small scale study conducted to evaluate feasibility, duration, cost, and adverse events, and improve upon efforts prior to establishing it as part of your launch business strategy. So it's the idea of, again, going into a market for 3 months and then evaluating, seeing how it's doing. Is it doing better than is your overall business doing better than how it was 3 months ago? What can things be doing to improve on it based off of like the price you were sending out, the quantity you were selling, how often you were in that market, all sorts of different things. And so, I'll read the second one because I think there's key elements here. A pilot approach is important for entering a market as it creates intentionality in using data for evaluations, along with emphasis on what is success. So the key thing here is, I mean, the terminology doesn't matter, frankly, at all. But what is important, and the reason I wanted to just focus in on this idea of like a pilot, is the idea that there's an intentionality to it, right? Like there is, it's a certain amount of time, right? 3 months, 2 months, whatever it might be, like 6 months. There is a reason you're holding a pilot, right? Like what question, like you wouldn't have a pilot unless there was some sort of question, even as general as, are my sales overall going to increase if I start selling, I don't know, 30% of my product through restaurants or something, there's some sort of question you have in relation to it. And then there's a method, and then there's some sort of data collection, because again, it's sort of a study. So there's some sort of data collection, whether it just be sales data, whether it be for the online sales, as Pritika was mentioning, the Mailchimp data, in terms of, engagement, quantity sold. There are things you're measuring for that period of time to just do evaluation. I think those are all very key elements to doing like a pilot study, and that's where the data fits in. And then I think we've all probably seen this, but without some sort of intentional approach to it, you can stay in an effective market for too long, you can price your product too high or too low, or not sell enough or sell too little, right? And those are just a few among many things that can happen. Of course, there's no sort of strategy towards piloting something. I mean, do people have sort of, I'm just curious if people have examples of lessons learned from essentially, needing to do an evaluation on a market that they realized later on was maybe wasn't effective or wasn't like optimal for them. Essentially, I think this happens that, I've heard this, of course, over and over again. It's not just this just happens when people stay in a market too long. That's not necessarily the best situation.
I think that has more to do with where your retail is. If you're looking at the retail market channel, everything is done on computers. They used to have a little more flexibility as far as working with, specialty items or unique items. But that's not the case anymore. They're tracking each item. It has to perform, it has to have a certain amount of sales, or they just won't carry it anymore. So, you have to have a conversation and say, do I really want to sell into this market or with this customer? And if I do, where does my retail have to be? And then you work it backwards from there. So, it's not, you can't leave it up to the retailer. You have to have a conversation with them. You have to say, well, if we do this, we can do it, you can do that. It has to be, they have to feel like you're participating and have investment in the fact that it's going to sell through to the consumer. So, does that mean we have to do some social media, drop a social media ad or 3 ads into your market? It's a negotiation with them. So, don't stay at the mercy of the retailer to come up with everything for selling your product. You really have to work with them. It has to be a conversation. But if you go in with data, which you can get, if you've, done any kind of online sales or anything like that, consumer feedback, any kind of consumer feedback, then that gives you leverage when you're talking to retail. So, I mean, that's,
Right.
like I
Yeah.
said, specific to that channel. But you know, it's just what I've found over the years works best.
Well, I think, I mean, what you're saying might be specific channel, but I think having the data to justify, I mean, going into, like, you know, you're going into any different market, like going into selling to restaurants, selling to through a CSA, selling through a farmer's market. I mean, having some sort of data to justify sort of what you're, like, having prepared for what you're doing by looking at the data, whether it be looking at the average price of the product being sold in farmers markets in the region or something like that, is valuable to, I mean, that's of course valuable to selling through farmers markets, but I think that idea of being prepared using the data is critical no matter what market you're going into.
Well, and you talked about CSAs, and that's a subscription base. So
Right.
you better be developing a relationship with those consumers. And, you know, if they drop off, why did they drop off? You know, just don't, sometimes, you know, if you can find out the answer to that, then you can make changes in your operation to make it more effective. So it's developing that relationship with them, whether it's through a newsletter or whatever. You know, you're carrying on that conversation, and you're making them understand that their business matters to you. And so, and they're good leverage, you know, if you want to try and elevate to say a retailer in the area or whatever, you can take it to them. If you decide not to do CSAs anymore, you can take the data that you've gotten from those consumers and go into retail and go, you know, we have done this on our own. This is what we've sold. And, you know, you could probably pick up some sales if you'd like to work with us. So, you know, it's different ways to spin that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that in terms of what you were mentioning, in terms of if there was a drop off in membership. I think you mentioned at some point, you just sort of offhandedly mentioned it. Why did that happen? But that's like that is the idea of going back again to this. Sorry, I'll just go a little bit off track, but just going back to note this one more time. That is the idea of a feedback loop, actually, because to some extent, because sort of you're trying to sell through CSA, say you see a drop off, and the question is, why was there this drop off of 20% of my membership over this period of time? And sort of you're collecting data to measure what is happening to some extent, right? Like you're sort of repeating, correcting for it, trying, experimenting to fix this issue, but you're then focusing in on that sort of question of membership. I think that's like,
well, you can't correct it if you don't know why it happened.
Exactly.
You know?
Right. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. All right. Okay, so I'm going to keep going here. So in terms of some of the key takeaways for piloting a new market, you know, it's a key process for early evaluation and course correction. We were just talking about course correction just a second ago, to sustain and build your business. And, you know, well, I'll actually get to it in a second. Key takeaway number 2, the piloting process is ongoing. I think that's a key point here. And we think about piloting as and again, this is just the concepts. These are just terminology. So but just to be clear here, the way I'm sort of talking about this is every time you make a change and you're evaluating in relation to that, you increase price by 20%. So now you're piloting how you're selling at your farmer's market with the 20% price increase. And you're seeing how that goes. So it's just an ongoing process. You're just continuously trying to improve on what you're doing, optimize your price, optimize sales, ultimately like trying to improve, sustain, and grow your business. So just thinking about it as this ongoing loop, essentially, is important. And then finally, in relation to data itself, yeah, it's used to make and evaluate decisions. So if there's like kind of one point to note for really all 3 sessions that we've had, it's really the idea that data needs to have a purpose. So again, this is why we keep going back to the idea of data for decision making. There's all kinds of data you can collect, all kinds of data that's publicly available. But ultimately, it's too much, frankly, to just like be usable for small farms, frankly. But so you need to have a question, or you need to be able to make a decision off of it, which is why you need to focus on what is the question. What are you trying to learn from this? Any questions so far? Before we go into a quick sort of like activity here, it'll be a sort of a group activities discussion. But any questions so far on piloting, on the feedback loop, on where data fits into this, or any questions that are just in general? Give people a second.
I mean, one of my questions is does this have to be a real life pilot, or can you do it hypothetically in any way? Because it's, like launching into a CSA business is a big commitment. So that's one question on my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the idea of a hypothetical, well, at least when I'm thinking, the first thing I think of is the idea of scenario planning at that point. So I think that piece can often happen before really doing much of anything, frankly, in terms of like actually going into a CSA or going into a new market, because you're sort of identifying what the risks are. And this is what just, obviously Elizabeth knows this, but this is what we talked about in the second session. So the session before this, so that this resource is out there, but it's about like identifying different risks and different key factors, and being able to utilize some of the assessment assumptions you have through your own experiences or through information that's available out there to sort of think through what happens if I sell at this price and this quantity, like, and start like making combinations and sort of think through how does this actually affect my overall business. Of course, there's no necessarily replacement for actually implementing and trying and experimenting and continuing to move forward, but it is at least one path to use some level of data to assess how you might do. So you're not sort of going into a blind, basically. And it's much more of of course, piloting takes, you actually have to go and start working it, start selling through the CSA or through the restaurants or wherever. Through scenario planning, the approach really is you don't have to do those things. So I think that probably would be the way to go.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So just like putting weight on the session 2, which like that scenario planning happens before your pilot, and making sure you have, as much ready to go in advance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Great question. Any others? All right, well, if things pop up, throw it in the chat or let me know. All right, I'm going to keep moving on here then. So sort of our final piece is just sort of a kind of a discussion to make sure everyone's sort of, I guess, getting kind of things we're talking about. I was going to write these things down. I think with our group, I think we could probably just like talk this out. So I wanted to just see from you all in terms of, we talked about, let's say we started selling to a, we're selling Apple. It doesn't really matter what we're selling here, but like we're selling apples, and we're now wanting to sell, we want to shift, say 50% of it to selling to through a farmer's market. If we wanted to do a pilot of this, so I wanted to just like hear from you all. We talked about the types of questions that are important, that are good questions to have for a pilot study. They need to be things that are testable, in that you can actually collect data to answer to respond to the question. and they are relevant and they're time-based. Going back to this here, I'll just go back to this really quickly. Right there, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based in terms of the questions. So I just wanted to see what, just give me, like, if you can give me, say, like an example question of selling into a farmer's market, like doing a pilot study. First, you can answer any of these questions first. I can even answer the duration. Let's say we want to do a pilot for, assuming it's like a weekly thing. Let's say for 10 weeks or 8 weeks, doesn't matter. We want to do a pilot. It's essentially 2 months. What are some of the, what is like a question we could want to have use data to answer for this type of a pilot? There's of course no right answer here, of course, but I'm just looking for any thoughts. What would be like an example question?
Maybe is our product appropriate for farmers markets?
So, okay,
Like-
that's great. So let me dive a little bit into that. So when you say appropriate, because I think that's a good question. Definitely an important question. Because just to kind of move forward from that, like it should be a question for this kind of to work to some extent. It needs to be sort of a question that can be as close to definitively answered as possible. So
maybe more
maybe
along
we
the
get a little more
lines
specific.
of what type of product sells best in farmers markets. So first, like in my case, would having planters with a mix of plants in them versus selling a 5 gallon of one plant, which would sell better? Is that maybe a good question?
Yeah, that is. Sorry, I just want to make sure. Oh, right. That is a much better question. So the idea of, oops, I'm gonna go back to it. I should have put it on this slide. It's on the next one. But just so we can see it. So do you mind, I don't know if you still remember, but do you mind saying that question one more time? Because I think using it under the filter of SMART here is like a good way of saying it. I think you fit most of them though.
So, specific. So it would be a planter with a mix of plants versus a single plant in a container, say a 5 gallon of something.
Yeah.
So it would also be measurable because you're comparing one against one.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was kind of a key point there. So you're comparing, you're doing a comparison, because oftentimes the idea here is really to, almost always actually, I shouldn't even say often, the idea is to kind of compare it like where you are to some sort of like new approach or new selling point or new market, something new basically, right? The scientific terms here are like the experiment and the control. The control is really the current state, how things are going right now. And of course, experiment is like with doing something different, essentially.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, the idea of that comparison you're mentioning, that I think, if I heard enough of it correctly, I think can actually be, you can collect. So like, just following that through really quickly. Let's keep going. I'm going to skip around here a little bit. So for that question, what kind of data would you collect?
Well, say that selling the single in a container is your control. This is something that you normally sell. So do you sell more of the singles in the container versus do you sell more of them as a blend in a planter?
Perfect. Yeah. Because and I think the why is pretty obvious why you'd be doing those things, and you can monitor the sales. I think the why and how are probably there. And yeah, I think, and those are again very, what is it? that information is accessible to you, like you can get that information. Yeah, so that is the only thing I would say about that is oops, no, go in my direction. Is, well, I think I already mentioned it for 8 weeks. Yeah, so essentially the idea there is you're doing that comparison for a certain amount of time, doesn't matter. I said 8 weeks, just it has to be a duration. You would do that comparison for a certain amount of time, and then evaluate your sales. And then the idea there would then be to look at, and I guess we didn't necessarily get to this, like what is success? Maybe it's obvious, but like, can you let us know what you would see as success then?
Well, I would probably say, since planters would normally be a higher price than a single, say, a 4-inch. So I'd probably compare them against selling them against a 5-gallon. So do we sell, because the price point would be pretty similar. Do we sell more of the planters that have the mix than we do of the 5 gallons that are the same price point? And of course, the success would be increasing of your overall sales would probably be the case, right?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, it's something you can check on. Yeah, so that's perfect then. So that's like, I think those are, I mean, it's always ways to refine things, but that is basically how we want to do this. Like you have a question that is specific, measurable, achievable. It's all those smart points: achievable, relevant, and time-based. You have a certain amount of time you are assessing it for. That could be, it just depends on whatever you want to do. I mean, presumably you probably want to see it, if you're selling it at a farmer's market, you probably want to see it for more than one time. So you probably want at least a few weeks. Yeah. Checking this out. You need to know what is success, like what is actually good, because if not, you're then going to get the information and be like sort of look through it and not really know what you do with this, because you haven't defined what do you want to get out of this, like what is it, and then finally, yeah, you sort of talked about the quantity sold. I'm sure there's other things you can even collect from there, but that is the idea. Like you're collecting this data, and then you just continue to collect that information during that whole pilot period, those 8 weeks. And then, obviously you can make mini evaluations throughout, but like after that 8-week period, you definitely sort of see that as a period. You do all the things we talked about, that feedback loop, you assess it, you analyze it, and then you sort of course correct, right? Maybe you need to now sell one at a lower price. Maybe you need to sell it in a different market. I don't know. Like you need to do something different. But then when you do something different, I think then it's a circle, right? Then you keep following this path, right? You do something different, you try it out. Now you see if this works, and you have a pathway to do that. So that's, yeah, that is perfect. I would continue to ask other people more of these, because I think this is that was hopefully useful. I think that's exactly how you're supposed to do it. But I want to make sure, I want to stick on time here. So thank you. That's great. That's a great example. And we're going to share these slides anyway, so you'll have like this general framework all available to you anyway. So just a few points here. After you do an evaluation, like we just talked about, 8 weeks, what's selling better? You want to make sure are you actually doing this piloting approach correctly, right? So are you actually able to make the decisions that you want to make based off the evaluation? If not, then you might be collecting the wrong information, or you might not be defining success well enough, or might not have the right question you're asking, right? Hopefully you find it before the 8 weeks, but you want to, of course, improve on how you're doing things as well. And other questions, I was mentioning collecting the right data. Should you be asking different questions? And then generally, are there risks you do not foresee? So like, are there maybe other questions you should be asking, right? Other things. And notice I'm talking about the questions, and this is a data session. The focus here is on the question. The data is supposed to support answering and responding to those questions, which is why that question side of it is so incredibly important, and that's why Marie, when we and others, like, when you mentioned sort of the initial question, sort of like pushed a little bit on that to get to a more specific question, because that second question you had can be answered. And so that's a good question, right? And that's where we want to get to, basically. Cost to capture information. So there's other questions you can answer. And then sort of just a few more things here. So this is, I wanted to showcase the feedback loop one more time. I thought this diagram was actually just pretty insightful, pretty useful in terms of actually seeing this, because it's talking about different iterations of it. So for example, you can see my cursor here. So essentially, and this is of course not even about farming, but this approach can be used in almost anything, like in terms of the sort of scientific approach to feedback loop. Different terminology for it. Development is essentially, you're getting ready to start selling your two different products at the farmer's market and see which one sells better, right? You test it. You're designing it. You are actually, this is actually the experiment, and then you're analyzing it, testing what you're doing. Say one sells better than another. Now what you want to do is go into basically what they're showing here is the fact that you just keep, this is basically a feedback loop 6 different times, but it just keeps going, right? You then go to another iteration of the feedback loop. Maybe now what you're doing is you are selling one in one farmer's market, another in another farmer's market. I don't know, because you've now decided that it's better to sell one product one place, one product another place. You're selling less than you were initially. You're doing the same thing, right? You were designing that sort of experiment. These are all, I know it sounds fancy in terms of the terminology potentially, and like no one has time for that, but you are inherently, everyone is doing some level of an experiment pretty much at all times, right? So these are experiments that you're doing, but you can call it whatever you want. You're developing it, you are again testing it. Does this make sense? And you sort of keep going, and keep going. Sorry, yeah, Katrinka?
Sorry, my dog is
Oh.
at my feet saying, "Take me outside."
Okay. Well, you can go outside in about 5 minutes. I'm just kidding. So basically, yeah. So, and I've noted the points here, right? So the first is develop. I'm just mentioning again, calling it an experiment. You call it whatever you want, but you're developing what you're evaluating against, right? Your experiment. You have a question. You have an approach to evaluating it. You know what data you're collecting. You're basically going through all those steps we just went through. Marie and I just went through there. You're implementing it over X weeks, X months, even years. Collecting data, you're evaluating, then you're redesigning. That's all this is, and you just keep going, right? This is, in some way or another, everyone's doing something like this, but this is just like, the idea here is to create some sort of an intentionality to these types of experiments, to evaluate your market, new markets, and even your course. I think this probably goes out saying, but even the markets you're in, like, this is just useful for any market to continue to optimize, to think about it this way. And then finally, I know we're running towards the end here, but what makes for a good lessons learned? What makes for a good question for a market evaluation? So we've talked about what makes a good question. Again, the slides are here, so in case you forget some of the acronyms, that the SMART acronym is super important here. Actually it's mentioned here as well in the third point: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. That's what you want in a question. Talking about the value feedback loops, you need to collect data that is responding to a SMART question. So again, the question comes first, and then you collect data based off of that. And we talked about how to effectively develop a pilot study. All right. And then, so any questions on any of this? And I will just mention, and I'm not going to go over it, I did think this was kind of a funny diagram on a side note, cartoon here. Basically, we've talked about a lot of things. This session and the last 2 sessions before is scenario planning, and then before that, data for decision making. And the kind of the point and the reason I even have this diagram here, I just thought was funny. Not only just thought that was funny, but basically we're trying to talk about potentially a new way of doing things to some extent. And so oftentimes I feel like in any business, when you're trying to do, when you try to like, people talk about doing something new, it can just be ignored. It could be circumvented, you know, no one wants to do it. And you just end up doing the same thing you were doing before. But for this to, of course, really work, you have to start thinking through, yeah, like, what is the right question to ask? Like, how do I see this as actually a pilot? You know, like, what is the duration of this pilot? And just go from there and like really try to do a little bit of a, maybe a little bit, maybe a lot of a change. But these are like proven approaches to evaluation that I think do fit really well within evaluating your market. All right, that being said, I know we're at the very end here. Any questions on any of this? Or those who've been in other sessions, any of the sessions, frankly. I will. Oh, there's something in the chat there. All right. Well, if there's no questions right now, sounds like. You can see Elizabeth has the a survey form there. I did want to just note here. I don't know if you want me to go through this. I can go through this really quickly, I guess. Just reiterating CAF Small Farm Tech Hub, which is we're super excited to be working with on these sessions. Provides the Tech Hub provides free technical assistance to farmers in California, and this is actually oldish, but thank you from CAF. And I did want to just mention, of course, you can reach out to CAF here, techhub@caf.org. Actually, I guess here, I'll just put it in the chat. If questions do arise as well later on, feel free to email me. I'll just throw it in the chat as well on any of these sessions. And definitely encourage you to see the ones prior if you haven't yet. But thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you, Prem, for the webinar series. And thank you everyone for attending. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. And